Welcome back to the Aventura Turnberry Jewish Center for the fourth of four. Time flies. I was reminded before this class that President Putin was interviewed by Tucker Carlson and gave a long rendition of Russian history and his interpretation and grievances. And I didn't get to watch the interview, but I'll let some of you weigh in and let me know whether or not it was correlated to what I shared in the last class regarding, the Russian narrative of their history and why, their perception of Ukraine and its being part and parcel of Russia is different than obviously what the rest of the world thinks. I talked a little bit last week about some conflicts between President Zelensky and General Zaluzhny. Well, General Zaluzhny is no longer head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was dismissed a couple of days ago in favor of Alexander Syrskyi, who was head of the ground forces. These are things that the world is watching, and without going over each of the first three classes, maybe we could talk about in Q&A. There are 64 countries and the EU that are going to be holding elections, have held or will hold elections in 2024. This is not just an election year, it may be the election year. Over half the world's population is going to the polls. Now, some of these are rump elections, North Korea, Pakistan, Bangladesh, but most of them are real democracies. India, many of the other countries, India is the biggest obviously, China doesn't have elections. Taiwan had an election, and William Lai, who's the successor of the outgoing president, won. This is the party that's considered to be less inclined to do a deal with China, so the Chinese were not particularly happy about that. And obviously I think there are going to be some challenges for the administration with the Taiwanese perspective and America's historic one China policy. We'll talk about that when we talk about the differences. So even though you have 64 in the EU, so 65 major elections, remember there are 400 plus million people eligible to vote in the EU election. These are massive populations. And the one that everybody's really focused on, not just here in the United States, but globally, is the one that's coming up on November 5th, 2024. It looks like it's going to be a rematch. Many things can happen. And again, I don't want to dive too deep into the weeds, but if one person is or isn't still healthy or standing or capable of getting elected on November 5th, what happens? Does it matter if it happens before the convention or after the convention? Yes. Does it matter whether it happens after the election and before the inauguration? Yes. But you need a whole spreadsheet to look at the different permutations that could take place. But let's look at what's at stake. So every 2 years, America goes to the polls. But the midterms, aside from local elections that are often held in conjunction with federal elections, are for Congress. So there are 435 congressional districts in the United States, and they're adjusted by population. So when the Constitution was written and ratified, that was the compromise. The compromise was you got a bicameral, two houses, you got the House and the Senate. So the Senate is 2 senators from every state, regardless of whether it's a big state or a small state, in terms of numbers. And the House of Representatives is allocated based on the number of people in that state. So they shift. So, Texas got 2 additional seats, California lost 1, New York lost 1, Pennsylvania. So there's been a shift from the Northeast, which had a pretty dominant role, certainly after the 14th Amendment. Historically, blacks were not allowed to vote, but they were counted as 3/5 in order to allocate seats in the Congress. So those elections tend to be less attended than presidential elections, which take place every 4 years. And so if you're a congressman, you've got to run every 2 years. If you're a senator, you've got to run every 6 years. So mathematically, there would be 33 or 34 Senate seats up for grabs every 2 years, right? Because a senator, it depends on what cycle you're in. So this is class one. Class one is the senators who were last elected in 2018. They're up again in 2024. So let's start with the senators. So there are 33 races for the Senate. Right now, the Democrats control the Senate. They have an advantage, or one seat advantage. They picked up an extra seat in 2022 when the big red wave wasn't even a pink trickle, actually. Not only did the Democrats do much better than they expected, they lost the House by a much smaller margin. Usually, there are exceptions, obviously, but the trend is that the incumbent party is going to lose, not necessarily lose control of the House of Representatives, but they're going to fare poorly because people like to complain, and we still live in a true democracy. And one way that you can complain is express the ballot box your disaffection with what's going on in general, and punish congressional representatives accordingly. But so the House of Representatives shifted from being a little bit pro-Democrat, a small Democratic majority with a razor-thin Republican majority, which got smaller and smaller. If you don't believe me, ask Kevin McCarthy, who had a pretty challenging experience as a speaker for less than a year. But we'll talk about the House in a second. In the Senate, the Democrats control the Senate. Chuck Schumer is the Senate Majority Leader, and when it was a tie from 2020 to 2022, the Vice President casts the deciding vote. And that's Kamala Harris, so if you have a Democratic president, which we do, and a Democratic vice president, which we do, then they will control the Senate even if it's 50-50 tie, but it's not. I don't see any way in which the Democrats hold on to the Senate in 2024 because of the math. It just doesn't work. I'll take you through some of the key Senate races before we get to the House and then the White House. But there are, like I said, 33 seats up for grab. There are two special elections, one in California and one in Nebraska, to vote for a senator that's going to complete the term of Dianne Feinstein, who passed away, and Ben Sasse, who became president of the University of Florida. Nebraska is going to elect a Republican, California will elect a Democrat. There are 10 seats that are kind of in play of the other 33. 2 are held by Republicans, 8 are held by Democrats. One of those Democrats is Joe Manchin from the state of West Virginia. He's not running for re-election. Trump won West Virginia by 40 points. So this is a deep, deep, deep red state. There's no way, except if you're Joe Manchin, who was uniquely beloved in his state and was an extremely moderate Democrat and one of the 2 most important Democrats or senators, and had a lot to do with negotiating some of the very few compromises that took place over the past 3.5 years. He's not running for re-election. A Republican, probably Governor Jim Justice, will win that seat. You have other Senate seats that are in play. The 2 most vulnerable Democrats are Sherrod Brown in Ohio and John Tester in Montana. These are both Democrats that are running in states that Trump won twice. He won Montana and Ohio in 2016. He won them both in 2020. And J.D. Vance, who's the junior senator from Ohio, and one of the few people that Trump supported that actually won in 2022, did win. So Ohio used to be, for those of us who remember, sort of Bush Gore in the 90s, 2000s, Ohio, like Florida, were swing states. They're not swing states anymore. It'll be very. Sherrod Brown is a relatively popular senator, but he's deemed quite vulnerable because the general trend in Ohio has been more and more Republican. There are 5 Senate seats that are up for grabs in states that are considered swing states. Just to go through now, what are the closest states if you look at the polling? So you've got Arizona and Nevada. Arizona is a swing state. That's new. Arizona used to be a very deep red Republican state. Think Barry Goldwater, think John McCain. It's not. Both the governor and the last Senate race went to Democrats. I mean, you saw Trump lost Arizona. Well, Trump actually lost all of the swing states except for North Carolina. So you got Arizona, Nevada, sort of in the Southwest. You have Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin in the Midwest, and you've got Georgia and North Carolina in the Southeast. Those are, and Trump only won North Carolina. Now he's actually polling even more strongly in North Carolina. I think North Carolina, I spent a lot of time there, I talked about it a little bit 2 classes ago. I think North Carolina is probably on its way out of being a swing state. It's becoming more and more Republican. But places like Georgia and Arizona and even Nevada that historically were solidly Republican are becoming purple. All of the attention is going to be placed in those 7 states. If you don't live in those 7 states, you're not going to see presidential candidates, you're not going to see surrogates. They're going to get a massive disproportionate amount of the media attention, dollars, investments. Those are the ones to focus on. And 5 of them have Senate races. So Debbie Stabenow announced she's not running again in Michigan. She's a Democrat, and they're all held by Democrats. Tammy Baldwin in Wisconsin, Bob Casey in Pennsylvania. Arizona is extremely interesting because the current Senator, Kristen Sinema, won as a Democrat, but she alienated the Democrats because, like Joe Manchin, she wasn't sort of on board with all of the initiatives that were coming out of the White House, so she's now an independent. But the thought is that she would take away many more votes, siphon votes away from the Democratic candidate, which is 2 rich businessmen are sort of fighting for that in a primary, than she would from Carrie Lake. I don't know if you know who Carrie Lake is, but Carrie Lake ran for governor, she lost. She's still contesting her loss. And, I think Carrie Lake might actually win that seat because the other 2 are really gonna compete with each other for certainly the left-wing votes and the centrist votes. So, look, Tester and Sherrod Brown are vulnerable. Joe Manchin is already in the Republican seat. So, I mean, even if every other one of the 8 states went the way they were going to go, they would need Joe Biden to get reelected in order to break the tie, because it's going to go from 51-49 to 50-50. The Democrats have nowhere to look. There are only 2 incumbent Republican senators that are running that are considered even a little bit vulnerable. One is right here, Rick Scott in the state of Florida. He used to be the governor. He won 2 terms as governor. He won 1 term as senator. He won every single one of his 3 elections by 1 percentage point or less, and he's poured over $100 million of his own personal fortune into this, and therefore people think he's vulnerable. But he won all of his previous elections, and he invested as much money as he thought he had to get elected. The most likely person running against him is Debbie McCarcel-Powell, who's a 1-term congressional representative in South Miami. She's a very pleasant person, but I don't think she has the gravitas or the fundraising ability. And Florida really is no longer a swing state either. So the fact that the Democrats are dreaming of unseating Rick Scott is, I think, Pollyannic. The other one is Ted Cruz. Ted Cruz is sort of, a character that's known to a lot of people. Beto O'Rourke ran against him 6 years ago, was very well funded and lost. Texas is not, in a statewide election, has not elected a Democrat since, when I say statewide election, that's, president or either one of the senators, governor, attorney general, secretary of state. So a Democrat has not won a statewide election in Texas since Ann Richards, who was a governor before George Bush in 1994. So, and every other single Republican running for the Senate is bulletproof safe. So there are 8 addresses for Republicans to take a seat away, and West Virginia is a given, and I would say 3 or 4 of the other 7 are possible. Brown and Tester are probable, and Scott and Cruz unlikely. So what that means is you can expect the Senate to become Republican in 2024. The House of Representatives is a complete mess. So without getting into certain House races, I'll talk a little bit about AIPAC because I think it's very important what AIPAC is doing, and we're all kind of on the same page in the room, hopefully, as far as that's concerned. But House races aren't as competitive as they used to be. There are probably in any given election fewer than 10% of House races that will that will switch from the Democratic to the Republican Party or vice versa, mostly because of gerrymandering. So what states are able to do is they're able to draw districts that make those districts bulletproof. So if you have a migration of 15 to 20 seats in the House of Representatives out of 435, that's a big swing. Why? Because here we're in Florida, we have 28 congressional seats. It's not a swing state anymore, but it's pretty close. So you think it could be 14-14, maybe 16-12. It's 20 Republicans, 8 Democrats, because you have a very strongly Republican-controlled legislature in Tallahassee, and they determine the districts. So there are 1 or 2 people running for Congress that may be in a competitive race. Everybody else, their election is determined in August, June to August, when they hold the primary. And whoever wins the primary, and this is why, one of the many reasons, there are lots of reasons, but one of the key reasons why elections are so, or politics in the United States are so partisan, is because in order to win your primary, in almost all cases, you need to get as many votes as possible from your own party. And if you're in a Democratic district, you want to be liberal, you want to be progressive, you want to be way out in front of the party in order to get that kind of attention. If you're in a Republican district, on the issues like abortion and gun control and immigration, you also want to make sure that you are getting way more attention and affection than your competitor. And in a presidential election, you then have to talk to the center. In some of these swing states, then you have to talk to the center. But in Congress, you never have to talk to the center. Once I've won my primary, where we live, people still think they're voting for FDR. I mean, this is not, a Republican can never get elected here, and they're in the same way that a Democrat can never get elected in, the northern part of the state. I think you probably heard this, but Florida might be the only place on the planet where the further north you go, the further south you get. And it's true. If you don't believe me, take a road trip. But so the House is going to stay pretty divided, and the Speaker of the House is relatively new, Mike Johnson. He kind of won by default because they weren't able to come to a consensus on anybody else. If the Democrats retake the House of Representatives, the House Minority Leader is a fellow by the name of Hakeem Jeffries from Brooklyn. I've had the privilege of spending quite a bit of time with him. He's very friendly with AIPAC. He's not quite Richie Torres, but he's pretty close. He's a very, he's an African American, grew up in Brooklyn, and studied law, worked at Paul Weiss. If those of you know law, it's a very prestigious firm in New York, and he's extremely strong on our issues. So I think the things that we're working on, I'm going to take sort of a parenthetic remark to give you, it's a commercial, but also an update on where AIPAC is spending its resources. AIPAC made a strategic shift a few years ago. This is kind of cute if you like English. They used to be a PAC, and they decided we're not going to be a PAC anymore. Instead, we're going to be a PAC. So don't call us a PAC, because we're not. We're now a PAC. So I know who came up with the acronyms, but what that means is they used to be a public affairs committee, which means like a catechism. We neither endorse nor disparage candidates. They did, but they couldn't admit to that because they lose their status as a PAC. And now they're a PAC, which is a political action committee, where they are actually getting involved in races. And 90% of their super PAC dollars are dedicated to Democratic primaries. So wherever you are on the political spectrum, if you're a Republican, you say, aha, see, we have problems with the Democrats. They don't like Israel, they're detractors, they're negative, and we definitely have a problem there. And if you're a Democrat, then you want to remind everybody that we still get bipartisan support, which we do, but it's really important to make sure that the Democrats who are going to get elected in those deep blue districts, of which there are about half across the country, that we're going to have people like Hakeem Jeffries, people like Richie Torres, and even if we don't get that lucky, that at least we prevent detractors from coming in. So the two first races that AIPAC announced that it's taking a really deep dive in, you also want to put your resources where you think you can win. So AOC in the Bronx is probably not so easy to defeat, and you also have to find a credible candidate to support. So, but next door to AOC is Jamal Bowman, who took Eliot Engel's seat, and he's been very hostile. He's been consistently anti-Israel. He's been one of the first people calling this a genocide, and I don't know if APRAC recruited him, but the community recruited George Latimer, who's the Westchester County Chief Executive, and he's going to run again, no Republican could win that seat, and he's going to run against Jamal Bowman in a primary. And there's a special, you can go on AIPAC's website, and there's called the Detractors Fund. So even if you don't want to pick and choose, if you're an American citizen or you have a green card and you're eligible to participate politically, that's, in my opinion, a very good investment of your dollars. Because if you trust the folks at AIPAC to screen and recruit, and I personally, having been involved with them since law school, have a lot of faith and confidence in the decision makers there. I think they're choosing wisely, because I think Jamal Bowman is vulnerable and George Latimer is a very attractive candidate. In Missouri, Cori Bush, people don't talk about her as much as Ilhan Omar or Rashida Tlaib or AOC, but she's right up there with Summerlee and a couple of others, and she's more vulnerable. And they found the county DA, Wesley Bell, also African American, very compelling candidate. So those are sort of the two first races that AIPAC has announced that it's going to participate in size meaningfully. And that's, I suspect, 2 out of maybe 10 or 12 where most of the dollars are going to go. But that's a little bit of inside baseball. Let's come back to the big picture. So we talked about the Senate, we talked about the House, now let's talk about the presidency. If you told anybody 10 years ago to fast forward to 2024 and Donald Trump would be running against Joe Biden. I mean, Joe Biden was running for president for years, but it would sound surreal. And this may sound young to some people in the room, but together these guys are going to be 160 years old. That's a lot of experience. But, and in President Biden's case, any way you look at it, it's quite apparent that age is catching up with him. I mean, he was the master of malapropisms even before, so he was never sort of known for being glib. But it's hard to watch. Some of the things that he does and says or doesn't do are hard to watch. But if you look at the landscape, one of the reasons why Biden felt that he had to run for re-election, first of all, he always wanted to be president, so it's not that he did this as a public service in 2020, but after over 40 years in various positions in government, his biggest credential within the Democratic Party is that he prevented a second term, right? And may live a long life, but when it's time to put something on his tombstone, that's what he did, right? If you have his view of the world, and you lived through a Trump presidency from 2017 to 2021, you were desperate to find somebody who made sure that president didn't have another 4 years in the White House. So when Trump announced on November 15th, 1 week after the midterms, that he's running for president in 2020, and he looked like a very weak candidate at that time. The indictment's already started, right? There have been 91 criminal charges filed against Donald Trump. And all of his picks, with very few exceptions, J.D. Vance was one of them, did really poorly. You know, there were a lot more Herschel Walkers than there were J.D. Vances. And it didn't look like he was really gonna be a center of influence. You had at least a couple of candidates, especially our governor here, Ron DeSantis, who was ascending, not just in terms of popularity, but also in his ability to fundraise. So it looked like Trump was just creating another media sensation, but whether it was internally or externally, he was never going to have the momentum to take this very far. So Biden, as a way to signal to the rest of the party, don't get into this hornet's nest, I got this, right? We did way better in the midterms than anybody expected, and they did. I talked about gaining a seat in the Senate. This red wave in the House, it wound up being a R+5, now it's an R+3 because 2 people left. So he felt very emboldened. What happened since, in the past year and a bit, has been very different. Trump has complete control over the Republican Party. He just does. He is wherever you are on the spectrum, he's either bullied or charmed his constituents to loving him. You know, we're going to read this Shabbat Mishpatim, which means laws or ordinances, and one of the most famous lines from this parsha is Na'aseh v'nishma. We'll do first, we'll listen later. His acolytes are passionate. I'm not, God forbid, comparing Trump to God, but his constituents think he is, right? There are people who are so, if you measured enthusiasm, right? If you could have a qualitative vote, not just a quantitative where one person, one vote, but if you had like a passion index, Trump would have won in 2020 by a lot, unless you apply like the Jeopardy rules, or if you give him the wrong answer, you actually lose points. And then you'd have to measure the antipathy towards Trump among those who voted for somebody else, mostly Joe Biden. That's not how we measure things. It's one person, one vote. And I still believe that America has legitimate elections. But I think, again, so much can change between now and November. But right now, the primary became a little bit of a joke. And I actually respect Nikki Haley, and I think she's campaigned very effectively. And when she launched her campaign, she says, I don't run to lose, I don't run to come in second place. And she's hewed to that line consistently for the past 6 or 7 months. But people just fell by the wayside. And most of them were extremely careful not to antagonize Trump for fear of being ostracized, exiled from the party that he completely controls. And he completely controls it even not holding any office right now. They were about to pass a border bill, a big one. And Senator Jim Langford from Oklahoma was physically threatened by people within the party once Trump came out and said, you can't do this. We're not giving the Democrats any wins in an election year. And they didn't. And they basically sabotaged their own legislation because Trump said he's going to punish people if they don't do his bidding. I mean, actually, so we talked about Mishpatim, right? So these are all about laws, and there are 53 mitzvot, commandments that we learn about more than any other parsha in the Torah. Actually, the Talmud addresses the content of Mishpatim more than any other parsha in the Torah as well. So you could say, listen, this is what the laws are all about. And if you don't like President Trump, one of the fears is that he's going to run roughshod over some basic laws. But if you do like President Trump, there's something for you in the parsha too, because this is the parsha where we learn about an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. And he's promised to take revenge over all the people who have wronged him and have crossed him. So there's a little bit of parsha for everybody this week. He is, unless something unbelievable happens, he's going to become the Republican nominee. This is as early as I can remember where there really isn't much of a contest, so the presidential campaign starts in January, where it's a Biden-Trump rematch. This has happened before. In other words, it's not the first time that a president and a former president face off against each other, but it's only happened twice. It happened back in 1888 when let's see which one he won. 1888. Yes, in 1888, Grover Cleveland and Benjamin Harrison. So Grover Cleveland was the only president to ever get elected twice to non-consecutive terms. So one person is the 22nd and 24th president of the United States. Also the only president born on the 4th of July. But, so was I. But he won, and then he lost to Benjamin Harrison, who was the only grandson of another president, William Harrison, who was also the shortest serving president. He served for like a month. He got pneumonia because he spoke too long at his inauguration, so there's a lesson for me there too. But it was cold and wet, and he wasn't wearing a coat. Didn't think he looked good. But so Cleveland actually, in the election that he did lose, won the popular vote. One of only 5 times in American history that somebody won the popular vote but didn't get elected. In one case, actually, Andrew Jackson won the popular vote and the electoral college vote, but it was a plurality and not a an outright majority, and it went to the House, and John Adams, John Quincy Adams, the son of John Adams, became president for one term, and then Jackson won, and Cleveland won again after losing his rematch. And the other time was Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt lost, they both lost. So you had Taft, who was the incumbent president, Roosevelt, who kind of mentored Taft, and then didn't like what Taft was doing, so he ran against him, and they both siphoned votes away from each other, and Woodrow Wilson became president. And that was in 1912. So it's been a while. It's been 112 years since a former president ran against each other. Never have you had candidates with this much life experience, if you will, contesting an election, and never have the stakes been so high on a global stage. And we talked a little bit about this in the last class. What are the implications depending on who wins and what can happen? So people have asked me, do I think there's any chance that Biden chooses a different vice president? Because there are many people that look, you're pretty frail, and he got really, really mad. The special prosecutor said that you didn't willingly hide documents because you got a bad memory, and Biden was adamant that he has a really, really good memory, and then he called President Sisi the president of Mexico. So maybe Egypt will take over Mexico, but it hasn't happened yet. Pharaohs, Aztecs, what's the difference? So he's got his vulnerabilities, but he's not switching horses. Kamala Harris is going to be the vice president. He can't choose anybody else, right? He'd have to find another African-American woman that James Clyburn from South Carolina likes, and he's not going to find that. So Kamala Harris is going to be the vice president. She actually went to high school a mile away from me. We graduated the same year. She went to Westmount High. I went to West Hill High. Yeah, Westmount High, that's right. Class of 81, way to go, Kamala. I didn't know her then, but her mom, they got divorced. Her mom got some, I guess, fellowship at McGill Medical School, and so she graduated from Westmount High. And there's nothing wrong with Kamala Harris, but she doesn't inspire a lot of confidence. She's trying her level best to try to galvanize support among younger voters and minority voters, all of whom have been very disaffected by the president for several reasons, but including his support for Israel during this current conflict. This has hurt the president a lot, and he's aware of it. And if he wasn't aware of it, people are telling him that. And I think that if we want to bring sort of this class tied to the first class, the support, the unexpected sort of support that Israel benefited from at the outset of this, I think that's also in play if these two leaders try to outlast each other, right? If Biden and others in the world who have this view of an accommodation with the Palestinians, a two-state solution, the PNA having a role in the reconstitution of Gaza, and Bibi, who has a very different, if they want to outlast Bibi thinking that he's vulnerable at home, and Bibi wants to outlast Biden because he thinks that there's a very good chance that this guy won't be president, and once again he can rise up from the political ashes and keep his role as prime minister. One of the many parallels between Bibi and Trump is that they're both under indictment. And, well, but it is funny, but I didn't mean it as a joke this time, because it has a role in what they are doing and how they're thinking about their political futures, right? You're kind of immune, you're supposed to be immune from prosecution or removal for, you have high crimes and misdemeanors, that's the impeachment standard here in the United States. Trump, went through this twice as president, but he believes that if he can kick the can down the road and get reelected, he can pardon himself. That's not a right that a prime minister in Israel has. There'll be a huge constitutional crisis if Trump does try to pardon himself. But I think that's the least of the factors that people are fearful of in a Trump second term. And here I'm not speculating. Trump actually put out a paper called Agenda 47, right? Coming back to Grover Cleveland, he was 22 and 24. Trump would be 45 and 47. And his Agenda 47 actually spells out what you can expect in a Trump term. Not the things we were talking about last week regarding Ukraine and China and Iran. We'll talk about that in a second, but domestically. Domestically, he has very strong opinions on constitutional law and the unitary executive. He feels that the whole administrative branch of government basically has been one giant deep state theft of power from the executive, from the president, to a branch, frankly, that's not in the Constitution. There isn't an Article 4. You've got the president, you've got the Congress, the legislature, and you've got the judiciary, essentially Congress, president, and the judiciary. But there isn't. These administrative agencies were established by Congress over time to have expert subject matter jurisdiction over a few fields. Trump has already singled out, I don't know why he singled out the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission, and the FCC, the Federal Communication Commission, but he basically says he's going to, emasculate those organizations because they don't do the bidding of the president. They don't do the bidding of the White House. They're too independent. So he has also something called Schedule F, which he tried to implement in October 2020, 1 month before the election that much of the world thinks he lost, to remove the tenure-like protection that a lot of civil service workers have. What does that mean? There are about 50,000 people that he would like to be able to get rid of if they're not loyal. That's the deep state that he always complains about, right? If you want to know what does the deep state mean? Deep state are bureaucrats who stay in their roles regardless of who's in the White House. If it's Democrat or Republican, you have these jobs for 20, 30, 40 years, and obviously there's going to be some transitions at the top, but that's your job. And from a constituent's perspective, you want people who have certain expertise, whether it's in transportation or communication or trade or health and human services. If you're a politician, not just Trump, but certainly Trump, you want people who are loyal to you. Now, he's not going to have to fire 50,000, but if he's able to reimpose Schedule F, then he just has to fire a few in each of these departments, and he'll create a chilling effect. And the other people are going to say, wait a second, I want to keep my pension, I want to keep my benefits, I want to keep my job. So that's an articulated plan. This is not something that it could happen. He talks about impoundment. Impoundment is another sort of, you're not a constitutional lawyer. So Congress has the power to appropriate funds. Appropriations is done in Congress. But if you're the president, and this has not existed since we got rid of this in Nixon in '74, but a president can impound a congressional initiative by refusing to spend the money. So Congress will say, we want to have this program, we want to deliver these dollars, and the president will say, no, I'm not doing it. And therefore you're kind of undermining the will of Congress that way as well. So there are many domestic initiatives that Trump has articulated, he has in his crosshairs, and he's already talked about, he didn't use the word weaponize, but using the Justice Department more effectively. Effectively, from his perspective, means going after the people, and he mentioned the whole Biden family, that he feels have done him wrong. Now, if you are Nasev and Ishma, if you're one of the Trump acolytes, then you say, yeah, you go get him and teach him. The deep state is wrong, and the deep state is an obstacle, and you've got the right ideas, and you're good for Israel, and you move the embassy, and you recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan, and you defunded the Palestinians. All those things are true, by the way, and I think many of us in the room would applaud him for all those latter initiatives that he deserves a lot of credit for, and the Abraham Accords. And if you like all the other stuff and it goes along with it, then great. But some people are concerned that a second Trump presidency would pose a real threat to certain institutions. And that's just domestically. The rest of the world is concerned that there's going to be a threat to some of the multinational, international institutions. Why? Because he said so. NATO. He wasn't a big fan of NATO. NATO got a lot more attention after Putin, Russia invaded Ukraine. But Trump, and again, I know where he's coming from. Trump was saying, listen, we're spending all the money for NATO. We're not getting anything for this. You're supposed to spend up to 3% of GDP on the military. Nobody came close. Nobody came close. A couple of countries were close to 2. And the United States is funding NATO. Now, NATO has a different role. He basically said, I wouldn't support Article 5. I'm not sending my kids to go fight and die in Montenegro. We actually chose that country. I don't know how the Montenegrin is spelled. But But that's an institution that has some value if you believe in some global world order and stability in Europe. Same for the Pacific Littoral, right? I mean, there was a comment here last week about, you know, Republicans love Russia and hate China, and Democrats love China and hate Russia. They're both very important countries, but Trump pulled the United States out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership. And that left the field pretty open for China. China's got its own problems. If you ask me what concerns me about the world, economic instability in China, a weak Chinese economy is not great for us. Obviously, we feel that they're this other global superpower and competitor. You'd like to see them get a black eye the same way they love seeing the United States get a black eye. But an economically weak China, in all likelihood, could also be a politically unstable China. And it's not going to be just, you know, Xi Jinping saying, okay, you know what, I had this job for 14 years, I'm done. It would be a massive upheaval, and they have, you know, economically structural challenges that are real. You know, Evergrande is the famous real estate company that went bankrupt. There's a lot more behind it. We talked about this also, I think, in the last class or 2 classes ago. Just cities that were built and are empty in China. The United States has very strong alliances in that part of the world that could be undermined by a president feeling that that's not our priority. We need to make America great again. Let's focus on home, on our problems at home. But you've got Japan, you've got South Korea, you've got the Philippines, you've got Australia, and it's not just political. It's not just military. It's anything that we touch, but we don't appreciate how much of the, let's say, critical minerals, rare earth materials that China controls. Actually, most of the rare earth materials are actually mined in China. Most of the other critical minerals that are not mined in China are processed in China. So when you're extolling the virtues of EV or solar power, and I like both, it's my business, but we're very dependent on elements that, like graphite, and gallium, and germanium, that China either has most of, or China is very friendly with the countries that have most of, and they've been investing hundreds of billions of dollars in their sort of geopolitical strategy. And it's worked. If you look at Chinese influence right in our backyard in Latin America, it's very impressive. If you look even in Eurasia, where they have stepped in to yet another vacuum that the United States participated in creating, it's worked. And Africa, that the United States doesn't pay that much attention to, I think a little bit more under this administration. I don't see anybody here under 10, so Trump called these a bunch of shithole countries. You know, that's was his sweeping designation of Africa, and I don't know if the Africans liked it so much. They probably would want to have Obama back. But they're a very appreciated continent in terms of global potential, what the future looks like. Africa has never gotten its act together economically, and they have 54 countries, more than any other continent. Most of them really are dirt poor, but the average age in Africa is 19. In the United States and China, coincidentally, it's 38. So that's half. The average age in Africa is 19. The life expectancy here is a little higher, but it's not higher by twice. So that's a very important difference. And China has so many other problems that are going to challenge them, including the one-child policy and the reverse pyramid in terms of fewer and fewer people supporting more and more at the top because they just had one kid. And now they've got rid of the one-child policy, but many of the people don't want to have more than one child. You know, they feel, I'm experiencing parenting, but I'm also experiencing economic freedom, and I can have a car, I can have 2 cars, I can go on vacation, I can buy extra stuff. So as the Chinese become economically better off, they're also more of a consumer culture rather than just a manufacturing culture. And so I don't see that being an easy situation if China's economy is in peril, and I don't know that there's a major difference between what a Biden administration or a Trump administration would do. I think Trump feels that he can just negotiate things. I mean, he didn't have such a great experience with Kim Jong-un. I visited him twice, a bunch of, I don't know if it was texts or emails, I don't know how the two of them corresponded. But, I mean, it didn't make things worse, but it certainly didn't make things any better. So this rapprochement that captured the headlines for a while never materialized. But I think Trump has a view, as he learned in real estate, that you can declare bankruptcy and recover. You can put your brand up and people will pay attention. It's all about the ratings. I'm not saying this cynically. And if you bash a few heads together, then people will understand. And if you're gonna live in a world where crazy wins, then you gotta be crazy too. And it's a strategy. And I think that there are many people probably in this room who feel that the United States is not as respected as it could have been if people thought that we were crazy. People think that Joe Biden is what he is, but people don't think that he's impulsive or crazy. And if you look at those who criticize this president and say he can't really make his own decisions, he doesn't know where he's going, other people are handling him, that could be true to some extent. But the people who are handling him, at least from where I'm sitting, are capable. They may not have your worldview, but when you look at somebody like Tony Blinken at the State Department, Lloyd Austin at the Pentagon, Sullivan, Jake Sullivan, head of the National Security Council, those are people who inspire confidence. If you look at the people that Trump is now saying that he's going to want to bring into his circle, you've got Steve Bannon, you've got Stephen Miller, you've got Jeffrey Clark. I mean, these are different people, to say the least. And look, he's not saying he's going to bring them on. He's not saying anything. He's actually been extremely strategic regarding keeping his cards close to his vest, even about that's going to get a lot of attention now. Certainly once Nikki Haley, if things progress the way they're likely to progress, once she exits, then there's going to be much more attention focused on who the vice president is going to be. It's not going to be Mike Pence. And look, Nikki Haley thinks that she still has a shot. I wonder whether she'll stick around to South Carolina, which is her home state. It'll be pretty embarrassing. She's 51 years old. She's got a long political future ahead of her if she wants one, and she does. If she loses South Carolina, gets bruised pretty badly there, then in 2028 or whenever she comes back into the fray again, it'll be very easy for people to point to how unelectable she is, right? People talk about Al Gore. He did win the popular vote, but lost the presidential election in 2000 by 5 electoral college votes, but he didn't even win his home state of Tennessee, right? If he won Tennessee, he would have been president, regardless of the Chads in Florida and everything else. So Nikki Haley lost the Nevada caucus. Trump wasn't on the ballot to no other candidate. In other words, she basically lost to a phantom competition, which was pretty embarrassing. And she came close enough in New Hampshire, right? She lost by 11 percentage points, but New Hampshire was her best shot of winning because that's where you have independents are eligible to vote in the primary, and they tend to have a much more moderate electorate than many other states. So she underperformed in New Hampshire. Nevada was a disaster, but it's extremely weird. They have a caucus and a primary, but they're run on separate dates. There's a lot of politics that goes on into selecting what's going to happen. The date to watch is February 24th, which is the South Carolina primary. If Haley's still in it and she wins it, then pretty much everything will be decided in early March. Super Tuesday, where 15 or 20 states, have their primaries, and I can't think of anybody who did really poorly in Super Tuesday and then went on to win their party's nomination. So that'll be dispositive. So at the very, very latest, we're going to know by early March. Assuming that either then or before, Trump is the only sort of person left standing, there are a couple of people that he's talked about. You have Vivek Ramaswamy, who's sort of like a mini Trump, and it was interesting to see how he and Senator Tim Scott were extremely careful not to criticize the president. Kristi Noem, who's the governor of South Dakota, has been talked about as a candidate. She actually chose not to run in the primary out of deference to Trump. The other two did, and then pulled away. Two people that don't get talked about a lot, but if you think about it, would be interesting potential candidates are Senator Tom Cotton from Arkansas, and the one that I'm actually, from a loyalty perspective, I'm very impressed by is Mike Pompeo. So both Cotton and Pompeo were Army, Harvard Law School graduates. Pompeo went to West Point. Actually, Cotton, I think, did Harvard College and Harvard Law School. But the point here with Pompeo is I think, really interesting. So he was a director of this, he was a congressman from Kansas. He was then Trump's first director of the CIA. He was promoted to Secretary of State. He was extremely loyal to the president, very strong on our issues, beloved in Kansas. And then there's an open Kansas Senate seat that was his for the taking. He could have just walked in and taken that seat in 2020. It was easy. And then Mike Pompeo could have spent the rest of however long he wanted to be in the Senate. And he didn't do it. And the reason he didn't do it is because it would send a signal that he didn't believe that Trump would get reelected. And he didn't want to send that signal. He didn't want to send that signal the same way that Nikki Haley actually bowed out before the midterms in 2018 because she wanted to sort of build her independent career, and Trump did not do well in 2018, so she didn't want to be associated with what she thought was a declining presidency. Pompeo did the exact opposite. He stayed on that ship. He was pretty quiet about it. He wasn't one of the most vociferous, stop the steal, rigged, fraud, all that stuff. I don't know what he says in private. I've never met him. But he gave up a Senate seat and started collecting money to run for president. He was here. Simon had a fundraiser for him. I wasn't there, but he was here. He was in Israel several times. He did a documentary with David Friedman. He lost 30 pounds. He was getting ready to run for president because he didn't think Trump was going to run again. And once Trump declared his candidacy, unlike all the other people who thought, like Pence and Haley, veterans of his first term in office, he didn't. So I would be impressed if Trump chose Pompeo as his running mate. But who knows? People think he needs a woman. People think he needs a minority. I have no idea what he needs. I have no idea who he's going to select. But I think many of the names I mentioned are capable people and could step up and do at least as good a job as he could as president. But I don't think he's gonna. He may hold off till the convention. That would be highly unusual in this day and age. It used to be that the convention would decide these things, but that's not the case anymore. You expect people to run together for at least several months before the general election. On the Democratic side, they're nervous. They're really nervous because Biden is polling badly. He is losing. When I mentioned the 7 swing states, he is losing in every single one of them. In North Carolina by double digits to Trump. To a non-Trump candidate, he's losing even more. Where does Trump get hurt? If a non-Biden candidate runs against him. So, people talk about, Gavin Newsom, of all the current people serving in positions in politics. You got Gretchen Whitmer she's the governor of Michigan. You got Amy Klobuchar, she's the senator from Minnesota. Gavin Newsom is the governor of California. He's the one who's been like the surrogate. He even had like a debate with Ron DeSantis about California versus Florida. So he's the one people talk about the most. Michelle Obama, Hillary Clinton, these are, in my opinion, fanciful names. I don't think either one of them would be recruited. There's no consensus in the party around any one of them. Hillary Clinton, if she wouldn't do it. If she did, she'd sort of run the risk of being, the United States answer to Shimon Peres, who never won an election. As president he did, but he lost the first time to Moshe Katsav. Anyway, I'm not touching that today. I don't think that Biden is going to, Biden certainly would make that choice, but he's not going to step away and say the polls are really, really bad. I care so much about this that I'm going to let a Gavin Newsom, who comes a lot closer to Trump and in some polls actually beats him in these swing states, take the mantle. He wants to be president, he wants to stay president, and he's got an uphill climb. And the reason is that nothing sticks to Trump. The 91 indictments, they don't stick to him. The New Hampshire primary was interesting because when they polled people afterwards, right, the people who did not vote for Trump, they really didn't like Trump. But again, these are moderates and independents, so it's not representative of the general population, certainly not the Republican population. So you're going to have his passionate core, and they'll stand by him under any and all circumstances. And then the question is voter turnout. Voter turnout was extremely high in 2020 because Trump was very polarizing, but that means he attracted a lot of people who were going to vote for him. And Biden was the non-Trump. Now, a third-party candidacy, whether it's by Robert Kennedy Jr. or some of the other people who are out there, he's really the only one. That hurts Biden more, right? Third-party candidacies in the United States are notable for how they affected the outcome. People don't remember who ran, but Clinton does not beat George Bush if Ross Perot isn't running in 1992. There's just no way he wins. Ross Perot pretty much only took votes away from George Herbert Walker Bush. And Clinton becomes president for 2 terms. And then in 2000, it's payback time. Gore does not lose unless Ralph Nader's in the race. Ralph Nader just took a few votes away, but in some key states, including Florida, that made those states close. So if Kennedy, who's a little eccentric, if he stays in the race, it's really just taking away votes from Joe Biden and giving an opportunity to people who want to punish Biden, especially in the African American community, especially in the anti-Israel community, especially in the woke progressive community that feels that he's not their guy. He's not, so the youth just can't relate to him, right? To the extent, I mean, if you think about it, I mean, we're here in the room and we're seeing somebody who just seems challenged. And challenged by the challenges of the presidency is a big leap. So he's really doing very poorly, and his approval rating is lower than anybody since they started polling in the Eisenhower administration. Now people can recover from that, and they have. You know, George Bush recovered from that in his second term. Clinton recovered from that in his second term. But Biden's in his first term, and he's you know. And Clinton and Bush weren't tested at the polls, right? Because they were term limited. I think this is going to be an interesting test. I think that what happens around the world is going to have a bearing on how people vote. You know, if you did watch the Tucker Carlson interview of Putin, who's going to be able to do a better job? Not just negotiating with Putin. Maybe people think that Trump will have the chops to, you know, look Putin in the eye and tell him who's boss, or be buddies with him and come up with some sort of deal. If you think about it, from Putin's perspective, he basically said, look, I want to negotiate with the West. I'm not interested in Poland. I'm not interested in the Baltics. We'll keep what we have, and I'll put in a friendly leader in Ukraine. We don't like Zelensky. We'll get rid of him and have whoever in Kiev that does the Kremlin's bidding. That doesn't mean Russia wins, right? Russia, any way you look at this, Russia is not a winner in this conflict, right? Russia's been sanctioned 11 times. Over half of its foreign assets are frozen, some of which have already been used, and I think a lot more will be used as part of the reconstruction of Ukraine. In all likelihood, you saw already Sweden soon and Finland already are members of NATO. In all likelihood, there'll be additional members. Could be Ukraine, Moldova, Georgia, certainly ascending to EU membership, things that would not have happened but for this conflict. And so those aren't wins for Russia. Everybody will spin it the way they want. But even if the Tucker Carlson interview accommodation is what ultimately gets negotiated, I don't think that's a win for Russia. What's going on now, though, is a big loss for Israel. And Israel has become political football. And a lot of people are angry at President Biden for threatening to veto an Israel-only aid package that frankly would have sailed through Congress. It would have sailed through the House, would have sailed through the Senate. It was $14.3 billion. And Biden said, if you put this through, I'm going to veto it. And the reason he said that is because he wanted to get his other stuff in there too. He feels that Ukraine is his signal foreign policy achievement. After the debacle in Afghanistan in 2021, his standing up to Putin and galvanizing the world and getting the EU finally to step up and participate in funding the Ukraine aid effort, he didn't want the Congress to forget that there is this responsibility to Ukraine. I think that he also wanted to send a message to Bibi. But meanwhile, all the back and forth has been detrimental to Israel's aid package. Then the Republicans proposed a $17 billion package, so more than the 14.3. But then the whole debate about whether to include border provisions, include Taiwan, separate Ukraine. I don't really know how this plays out, but I know that the longer it takes, the more challenging it's going to be for Israel, especially if Israel has to fight a northern war with Hezbollah. Ukraine already got a $54 billion, a 50 billion euro aid package last week from the EU. So it still feels like it needs, I mean, these numbers are staggering, but it still feels like it needs American aid. But put it this way, in a Trump administration, they would not be that reliant. They would not be in a position to expect those levels of foreign aid. I think Trump would much rather travel to Moscow and Kiev and see whether or not, or summon those guys to Washington and see if he could work out some sort of deal. Probably not that different than what you heard on the interview. But Israel's in a quandary right now. And I think that the relationship between the White House and the current administration in Israel is going to get worse before it gets better. I think that the patience for the Israeli reaction to certain proposals that are on the table will wear thin. I think that the unity that we've seen in Israel since October 7th will wear thin. I think it's already beginning to unravel a little bit. There's a lot of tension between the families of the hostages, other people who feel that the war needs to be prosecuted, I don't want to say without regard to the hostages that remain alive, but that we can't be completely hamstrung in doing what we feel like we need to do because there are hostages we don't know where, we don't know how many are alive. We don't know very much when it comes to that. And we're getting a lot of messages from the Israeli military and security establishment, once again, that we're winning this war, we've got them covered, we've taken out over half of the Hamas fighting force, and I have no way of knowing whether that's true. We've dismantled their military capabilities, we're exploding their tunnels. I mean, I hope that's true, but I think that to the extent that there's going to be more carnage shown on television and more sort of negative reactions from the Israeli administration to overtures coming from other parts of the world to enable a day after scenario where there is a two-state solution and where there is local Palestinian participation in the governance of the reconstituted Gaza, we're going to be in for a very difficult few months and longer. And I don't know how long, if Bibi decides to call elections, he can call them in 6 months, and that gets him into July. There aren't going to be elections here till November. So this idea of waiting out the Biden administration in the hope that Trump comes back and takes a different position, I think that's going to be a pretty expensive strategy. And I think that our enemies are watching. I've said this before in other contexts. If you think that Iran and Hezbollah and the Houthis and everybody else aren't paying attention to what's going on in the U.S.-Israel relationship, you're mistaken. And I think that, more than anything else, is going to determine who blinks first, because right now, nobody really wants an escalation of conflict, right? And who are the parties involved? So you've got sort of the Iranian alliance, which is Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, and the Houthis. You've got the U.S.-Israel alliance, right, with the aircraft carriers and everything else. And then you've got the Gulf alliance, right, the Saudis and the others, the Abraham Accord countries. Nobody wants the escalation. Certainly the Saudis would get hit by that too. But that second alliance is the U.S.-Israel, and that's the most likely one to be frayed. There's not going to be a fraying of the Iran, Hezbollah, Hamas, Houthi alliance. So there's if there's a risk of the U.S.-Israel alliance getting frayed, then the other guys are going to feel empowered. And that's one of the things that keeps me up at night. How that looks different, whether Biden or Trump is president, I don't think we have long enough to wait. So, not to be pessimistic, again, the polls are going to go all over the place. The TV campaigns, when I moved to Florida in 2006, this was the swing state. Every day you would have, in this synagogue, you would have Schumer or Romney or Giuliani or whoever it was coming and speaking. They go from this synagogue to that synagogue. They try to find a church. They'd have to leave Aventura, but they'd go somewhere else. Just, to be a surrogate or make their own pitch. Florida's not going to get any attention this year. That's okay. Let other states feel the love. But if you live in Nevada or Arizona or Georgia or Michigan or Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Wisconsin, that's it. You're going to be inundated. And those, again, you can ask yourself, how real is a democracy if a very small subset, and think of the biggest states. The biggest states by far are California, Texas, Florida, New York. Nobody's campaigning in those states. So all of if I just do the math in my head, we're talking about 120 million people. Nobody's paying attention to them because that's not where the action is. So get ready for a long ride, a lot of acrimony, as was the case in Israel for most of 2023 up until October 7th. It'll be pretty difficult to have a Shabbat meal if people don't agree with you politically. The good news, by the way, and I know a lot of us have thought about this in different contexts, the intermarriage rate in the United States has never been so low. It's actually below 4%. Republicans don't marry Democrats, and Democrats don't marry Democrats. I'll take questions.
Yeah. I know we have a long way to go before the election and a lot of issues before then. As a person who cares very deeply about Israel, I have other issues, business or whatever, but who cares about Israel, my thought process has been, well, Joe Biden, getting very old, if something happens to him during the next term and Kamala Harris becomes president, okay, versus Trump as president, and maybe Jared Kushner not as involved, influencing him in his next term as he was in the first term. Which administration over the course of the next presidency is going to be better for Israel?
So, did everybody hear the question? Okay, so between Kamala and Kushner. So as an aside, Jared Kushner and Ivanka Trump don't have, he's their father and father-in-law, but they're not in the inner circle anymore. They're not involved at all in this campaign. Without getting into details, I don't obviously know many of the details, but there just wasn't, it's not the same as it was. But I'm going to give you the answer I've been giving people for over 30 years. That the best president for Israel is the best president for America. And what Israel needs is Israel needs a strong United States of America. It needs a United States of America that's respected. It needs the United States of America that's often feared. And I don't have an answer for that because fear and respect are correlated, but they're not the same. So maybe a Trump America is more feared than a Biden America, but maybe a Biden America is more respected. And I think that what's really critical is to minimize the amount of daylight that's perceived between Israel and the United States. And I think so far that's been very successful during the Biden administration, especially given the fact that Bibi's been prime minister for now about a year of the three. That one out of the three, he was prime minister at the beginning too, so about 1.5 out of but certainly this last year, Bibi's been prime minister, and there were some conversations about the judicial overhaul, wrecking ball, but right now, it's as challenged as it's been. So if you look at October 8th, 9th, 10th as the apex, now we're at a nadir. I think that can be fixed. But I think the big challenge is that the message that needs to be sent in order to help fix that runs the risk of exploding the current coalition in the Israeli government. So that's, and I don't know exactly how that works its way out, because Bibi is speaking differently. We always criticize the Arabs for saying different things in English and different things in Arabic. It's happening now, but that's okay. You can say different things in Hebrew and different things in English, but say a little more in English. That's. I think that the Biden administration wants to hear a little bit more love for its worldview and less hyperbolic language coming from Jerusalem. Yes.
I hear the big problem with the Democrats is they talk a good story and they don't deliver. And one of the questions is, you talk about Trump sequestering money. Why aren't the Democrats giving out the money, especially now, so that they are delivering and getting people to respect them? What's holding that back?
The money to who?
Domestically.
Well,
a lot of people say the projects don't get done, things they promise don't get done.
So
That's what I hear is the biggest reason people aren't voting or going to vote.
Can you repeat?
yeah, the question is, the Democrats are famous for talking about giving away money, but they're not giving away the money that they talk about. That's your question. I don't know if that's true. I mean, I can tell you from the industries that I'm in, the solar industry, the water industry, the whole,
But then why do people feel that?
So that's a better question. That's a different question, right? So there's a sense that the economy is doing a lot better than it feels, and maybe part of that is that it's not as distributed across the board. The stock market is at an all-time high. Corporate earnings are strong. Inflation has been brought down. The dollar is still by far the strongest currency in the world. So why isn't there a general feeling among the population that we're doing pretty well? And I think a lot of that is messaging. I think that the Democrats are frustrated, but the dollars are there, and they are. I mean, the policies, the fiscal policy. If you look at the Fed and how they've managed this, I mean, we're not out of the woods yet, and I think that's one of the bigger risks facing the world, not just the United States. But the fact that inflation has been brought under control so effectively, and the soft landing that people thought was going to be pretty elusive looks accessible. I think that's a big win. But you're right that people don't see it as a win, and they don't feel it as a win. But I can tell you from the perspective of somebody who works in those industries and somebody who follows the markets and somebody who looks at the broader macro and microeconomic factors, this country's doing pretty well. You had a question all the way in the back.
Yeah, how about if you don't like Trump, but, the primaries count too, right? So why don't the Democrats change their party to Democrats to vote for whatever Republican person is running?
So that's an interesting question. People have talked about it. So here's the question. In order to vote in a primary, in almost all primaries, you need to be a member of the party. If you want to vote in a Republican primary, you need to be a Republican. You want to vote in a Democratic Party, be a Democrat. So, for example, I mentioned Richie Torres. I think there were a couple people in the room who were at a breakfast that we had with Richie Torres a couple weeks ago. So he's a rock star. And he's in a district that will never, ever, ever vote for Republican. But because he's so pro-Israel, and because he's so dangerous and threatening to the anti-Israel contingent, because he's Latino, he's black, he's gay, and yet he's so pro-Israel, and he's incredibly articulate. So he's at risk of getting primaried. So I tell my MAGA friends in Riverdale, which is also part of his district, but a wealthier than average part of the Bronx, just become Democrats. So some of them might, in order to protect, Richie Torres in a primary, but historically that really doesn't work well. There aren't usually enough Democrats, and there isn't. It's a theoretically very interesting strategy, but I haven't seen it implemented anywhere.
How come the Democrats
Well, because frankly, that's a great question. Why is the Democratic primary relatively uncontested? And the answer is, in my opinion, that nobody wants to look like a bully. As soon as Biden declared, because he's so vulnerable, because he comes across as being frail, you'd rather help the old man across the street than beat him over the head with his cane. Well, that's an immigration question. We'll save that for. I mean, but by the way, immigration needs to be fixed. There was a bipartisan proposal on the floor that would have passed this week, but it didn't for reasons we talked about. Yes.
You start to paint a picture on Trump, what he's going to do with his next administration. And at the very scary picture will be painted. And let's talk about what Biden administration did for the last 3.5 years. What happened in Afghanistan, completely forgotten. Ukraine, he didn't react. He let it put it, he followed what he did, he just reacted to it, not dictated. It's a disaster now, it's very bad. We said the EU supported it. Yes, the EU has been right next to Russia. Now wait, not because of love. Love is leadership, that's right. Now let's talk about Iran. You know, we don't want to escalate.
I know, but I really enjoy our conversations, but I want to give other people a chance. If you have a question, please ask it. Okay.
Especially Iran. Lots of sanctions that Trump was $4 billion from, and they have $140 billion. All this money went to vaccines. And he responsible for a lot of Russia.
Okay, so you're making a statement, and the good news is you've spoken in every one of these lectures, and your comments are always relevant and welcome. But if you have a question, this is an opportunity to ask a question.
The question is, you bragged about the Biden administration being so good, healthcare, Austin and everything. I think they failed miserably, and the leadership is very weak.
Okay, so your question is, am I going to take back everything I said over the past hour? No. Okay. Stephen.
I know this is the last in your series of 4 lectures, so I just wanted to say, Lenny, what an absolute pleasure it's been to listen to you.
Yeah.
And I say that not only because you're so knowledgeable and so smooth, I wonder how you do it without a note, but there it goes and it flows out. But you're so centered. You don't bring all the baggage that we're so inundated with. You tell it like it is. It doesn't matter where it comes from. You want to deal with the facts and the analysis as it is. So I just want you to know you're greatly appreciated, and we greatly enjoy this series. And I'll end with just one question. What can we expect from Trump in terms of Israel if he's elected? Will he remain pro-Israel like the first term, or will he go in a different direction if it suits him?
Thank you. So I'll repeat the question and answer it, but first I want to comment on your comment. Thank you for the compliment, but it didn't happen by accident. One of the reasons why I enjoy being here and enjoy speaking is because I've had good mentors, and frankly, starting with you. So Stephen and I have known each other for, I'm embarrassed to say, close to 40 years. When I was an undergraduate at McGill, he invited me to an event for the Hebrew University in Montreal, and you've been just a mentor, a friend. The kind of even-handed perspective on the world that you complimented me on is one that you've really exemplified, and your role in not just the Montreal community but the broader Jewish community is really worthy of another round of applause. So it's my turn. And Irene is right next to you, not just literally, but also in terms of all the wonderful work that you and your family do. I don't know what to expect from Trump on anything. and I say this without derision or cynicism. He signaled to the Jewish community that he was disappointed in their lack of loyalty and their lack of gratefulness. And there are Jewish ears that historically remember God forbid I'm not comparing Trump to Martin Luther, but other people who tried to be our best friends and reacted negatively, violently, lethally in response to our rejection of their overtures. So Trump left the presidency unwillingly, angry, and with declared vendettas that he would be inclined to prosecute, maybe. You know, his mantra on the campaign trail in 2016 was crooked Hillary, lock her up, and then he won and left it alone. I mean, it was a slogan. It wasn't really a fight he ever intended to fight. Was he a gracious winner? No. Was he a vindictive winner? Not then. Would he be different on this go around? I'm not sure. I mean, he was publicly adamant that Bibi was an unfaithful, disloyal leader because he congratulated Biden on an election victory. Biden, on the other hand, or people who watched closely, felt that Bibi wasn't fast enough. He took a really long time. He was behind most other world leaders in congratulating President Biden. He probably would have preferred that Trump stay on for another term. They had great momentum. Bibi has been Prime Minister of Israel for longer than anybody else. He never really had a chance to be Prime Minister with a buddy in the White House, right? He had Clinton during his first term, Obama for the next 8 years during his current run, and suddenly he gets somebody who he can actually get along with and speak with, and he really enjoyed that bromance. Trump felt that that Bibi punched him in the nose by congratulating Biden when he's running around the world saying that Biden is not a legitimate victor. I think that not so much because of Jared and Ivanka, but I think Trump's roots in the community are pretty strong. Trump's relationship with the evangelical community is relevant here. We don't have the support in that community that we used to, but it's still, probably as strong as we have in any constituency, including the Jewish community. Doesn't support Israel as much as the evangelicals do. So I don't think Trump would be overtly antagonistic towards Israel. Would he expend the political capital in a second term that he did in the first term to do some of the things that I highlighted in the content of my remarks? I don't know. And the world's changed since October 7th. So I think that if there were a Saudi rapprochement, certainly those seeds were planted in the relationship between Jared and MBS. But because he's so unpredictable, and because we really don't even know what his inner circle will look like, the Steve Bannons, the Steve Millers of the world, they're not natural friends of the Israel relationship. They're much more isolationist. They're much more focused on things going on here domestically. So it's hard to tell. I certainly don't expect him to be overtly hostile, even though some people heard things in his comments. But I don't know that we'll have long enough to find out. I still feel that it's imperative for the U.S.-Israel relationship to sort of trickle back up. I'm kind of more concerned about what the next 10 months are going to look like, or 9 months are going to look like. But if Trump gets reelected, I know that there have been unfortunate comments from people in the Prime Minister's coalition, the current coalition, about, yeah, he'll be better for Israel and all that. I don't think that helps the current climate either. Yes?
Some of my friends seem to think that if Trump had won the last election, that Iran would not have received the money that he did from the American government, and that this whole mess in the Middle East may not have.
Okay, it's a good question. Although I think some of those same friends probably think he did win the last election. And that ties into the question that maybe you were asking also. So, it's hard to tell. Certainly, when people talk about the money, nobody took Obama did actually. But Biden did not take money and give it to the Iranians. What they did is when you release sanctions, there are two ways you can give money. Well, there's three ways. One is what Obama did and actually delivered a suitcase of cash, a lot of it, and so that's off the table. I'm not comparing Obama to either of the current candidates, but there you can release frozen assets, which is what happened with the Qatar. The $6 billion that was, and then now it's refrozen again. Or you can release sanctions. And if you release sanctions, then you're enabling the Americans to have commerce with other countries. And they can sell more cheaply, but to other countries like India and China that are very, strong consumers, very large consumers of Iranian oil. And that's where the petrodollars flow in. And to your point, and you're right, those petrodollars are very often directed towards Iranian proxies, and I'm certainly not in favor of Iran having any money. And I'd like to see Iran, I don't want to use, incendiary terms, but I'd like to see a very different Iran, if I want to see an Iran at all. That having been said, and I think I touched upon this in the last class in response to a different question, there are people, Sharon famously said, what you see from here, you don't see from there, what you see from there, you don't see from here. There are complexities that are difficult to take into account because we live in a multipolar world. So Iran is not just Iran. I talked about the forces that are in play around the current conflict in the Middle East. But on a global level, you have certainly Russia, certainly North Korea, all of the nefarious sort of non-state bad actors firmly in Iran's court. China is trying to sort of play both sides, but if anything, their thumb on the scale would lean in the same direction. And they were pushing the United States to alleviate sanctions because they benefit. They benefit from buying cheaper Iranian oil, and there's a lot of pressure on the Western world, especially in the global South, to try to integrate Iran back into the global community because they don't feel the military threat that we do in Israel. But that's not felt in the West. If you're not Jewish and you don't care about Israel, you're not as bothered by Iran. You just aren't, right? If you don't have this in your kishkas, it's not what you think about. And we're sitting here in this room and say, why doesn't Joe Biden look at the world the way we do? Why is he giving the Iranians all that money? He isn't. He's releasing sanctions in a way that he's hoping to send a signal that there's an opportunity to try to resuscitate something that his predecessor administration thought was really good. I talked about Ukraine being Biden's signal foreign policy achievement. Obama felt that the JCPOA was his signal foreign policy achievement. I mean, from our perspective, it was an abject failure. It was a disaster. It was a complete emasculation of geopolitical priorities. But from their perspective, it was a way to bring some balance to the Middle East, to hopefully have several bulwarks, the Saudis, the Iranians, and the Israelis, three very powerful forces, throw in Egypt and Turkey, and they would all find some sort of way to accommodate with one another. Again, in my view, this was all looked at through a Western prism, underestimating, underappreciating the role that theology has to do with this, and that this isn't just about money, but it's about God, and you can't win that war. But I think if there's one way I can answer your question, it's they don't see the world the way you do. And they see the world with many more colors on the spectrum, many more vectors, many more sort of cells in the matrix, and not all of them point in the direction of decapitating and decimating Iran, because that'll make Israel's life easier. Yeah, I'll take these 4, and that's it. Yes. Well, okay. 1, 2, 3. Yeah. I'll repeat the question.
This question is in reference to AIPAC. I think it's a great organization. My wife and I attended 7 years ago in DC, a conference. And when we spoke to our Jewish Democrat friends, they felt at that time that it was a Republican-dominated organization. Is it, from your perception, perspective, since you work?
Yeah, well, the Democrats think it's being held hostage by the Republicans. The Republicans think it's being held hostage by the Democrats. which means we're doing a really good job. Yes.
After yesterday's, after what happened yesterday, and it was decided that Joe Biden can't be indicted because he's not really responsible since he can't remember anything. And because the polling is so awful for him, why do you think he's going to be the candidate? Or do you think that the party's gonna do something? I know he wants to be president, but does the party see it that way? And they're gonna try to do something different?
You know, it all depends what happens in Chicago this summer. So if we're now in July of 2024, fast forward 5 months, and there is an obvious ongoing erosion of his faculties, a key date to mark on your calendars is March 7th when he's delivering the State of the Union address. He'll be very prepared and packaged and prepped, and he'll have teleprompters. And you know, there's this game where if somebody does something, you take a shot or whatever it is. I mean, so there'll be people playing these parlor games, taking a shot every time he says something that's totally off the wall, and a lot of people I think are gonna get drunk that night. But he is the standard bearer of the Democratic Party. And if you care about Israel and you care about the US-Israel relationship and you recognize how critical bipartisan support for Israel is, then I think a flawed Joe Biden is a better Democratic candidate. I'm not telling you who would be a better president, but a better Democratic candidate than many of the people who are waiting in the wings. So if I'm looking at the future of the US-Israel relationship and I'm wondering what a second Trump administration would look like and what another Democratic administration would look like, I feel more comfortable just taking away the possibility of a Trump, just looking at the different iterations of a Democrat in the White House. I prefer a flawed Joe Biden to a vigorous fill in the blank. Yeah.
Two things I'd like you to comment on. One, there are people who agree with many of Trump's policies, like the Israel action when he was the president, but that January 6th trumps everything, and they can't vote for it.
Right.
And then there's the other people who don't necessarily agree with his policies, but feel he is standing up to the woke world. Those are the two.
Right, so the first group are the never Trumpers, and I assume you mean within the Republican Party. There are many people who felt that way about Trump before January 6, 2021, right? There are many people who found him to be an odious character and crass and vulgar and bully and all those things that didn't seem to stick in the primary, didn't seem to stick in the general. Although he lost the popular vote to Hillary by a lot, by 3 million, right? I talked about it happening 5 times. We talked about, 3 of them. If you want the other 2, it's Tilden beat Hayes in 1876 and Jackson beat Adams in 1832. But coming back to right now, I think that, look, that's what Republican primary voters decided, and there were more people in camp number 2 than camp number 1. There are more people who felt. There's some people who feel that the whole January 6th thing is totally overblown. They're calling the people who are imprisoned hostages, and Trump has flat out said that he's going to pardon all of them. And that's another, by the way, that's another thing that keeps me up at night, right? Whatever happens on November 5th will be a fiasco. Okay, I'm going to give you 3 scenarios. Okay? 3 scenarios. 1, Biden wins. There's a very low likelihood that Trump congratulates him and said, "You won fair and square. I underestimated you, but the best man won. How can I help?" There's a higher likelihood it was stolen, it was rigged, 2020 on steroids. 2020 on steroids. And I think everybody here would agree with that. There's another scenario where Trump wins. Biden will concede, or somebody will on his behalf. But there will be a very large segment of the country that will feel that this is an illegitimate president. that he should not have even been eligible to run for president because of the 14th Amendment and the insurrection. And there will be an enormous amount of civil unrest. We remember the summer of 2020, the Black Lives Matter, the George Floyd, the defund the police. You're going to see an exacerbation of that too. So even though there will be a formal concession and no real argument about the certification process in January 2025, it's going to be a mess. And then there's the third scenario, which is, I think, 2 or 3 standard deviations out of the realm of what people think about, that it'll be difficult to even hold an election on November 5th. There could be terrorism, there could be cyber attacks, there could be so much agitation. The temperature in the country could rise so high that the greatest democracy in the history of the world may have trouble holding a free and fair, transparent election on November 5th, and that would be an absolute disaster. So thank you for the question. I'm sorry I give you, and there's no fourth outcome. I don't see a fourth outcome. In other words, either Trump wins and that happens, Biden wins and this happens, or in the worst case scenario, we can't even have an outcome. So, not a happy year. Yeah, I'm sorry, I'll take it. You had a hand up. No, there was one person who had a hand up before.
Just very quickly.
Okay, just.
There's time, and and the one thing that bothers me about all of it is that during this time, or whenever, Iran gets their nuclear bomb together.
Yeah, that's a big concern. And your point.
That's everything.
I want to ask about the factors that matter in this rematch between Biden and Trump. Because both of them are the same people, sort of, that were the people are the same, sort of. The campaign will be similar to what it was.
Okay.
One will fill a stadium, the others will hide in his basement. So what are the factors that are different that will really matter?
Yeah, no, so you heard it wrong. They're not the same to each other. They're the same that they were 4 years ago. That's what he meant. Yeah, I'll leave your face. So I'll take that, and I'll take the questions together. Yes. Yeah, well, I talked about a third party already. Anybody remember? No? Okay. So I'll address it again. A third party candidate hurts Biden more than Trump. And your comment, and then I'll answer.
Thank you for painting a full picture as usual. I wanted to hear your comment on the problems within each party.
Okay.
The Democratic Party, a lot of that push and pull is about Israel, the Squad, the Bernie Sanders, etc. On the Republican side, does the approach to Israel enter into the differencing?
So I'll answer both those questions together. So yes, there are deep divisions in both parties. Not without precedent, but probably greater divisions, and that touches upon the question about which constituents each of the candidates has to address. So obviously, as the Republican Party becomes more extreme, and there's a litmus test that you need to satisfy regarding where you stand on immigration, where you stand on gun control, where you stand on even things like gay marriage and abortion are still back in the fray. And on the Democratic side, it's where you stand on wokeness, progressiveness, and entitlements, and immigration. Climate change is a huge thing. And there's a lot of variability among the sub-demographics, young versus old, college educated versus non-college educated, male, female, not so much. I mean, the two biggest things really are whether or not you had a college education. There seems to be a lot of variability there, and age. But they're the same people. They're 4 years older, but now they have to. So the biggest difference in Trump in 2016 and Trump in 2024, that Trump is now establishment. He is the Republican Party. And if you don't believe him, if you don't believe me, ask a Republican. They're not happy about it, but because of his punitive messaging, it's been very difficult for any Republican who hopes to have a political future, to run afoul of the president. He's basically declared that. You're with me or against me, there's no third option. The issues that are the parameters that are gonna run this, I think, have a lot to do with the economy, your question. I think that Trump is going to run on the fact that the economy is a disaster. It isn't, but people feel that it's much worse than it is. The foreign policy debacles, I don't think that Ukraine was an absolute disaster. I mentioned more of this in the last class, but Biden actually stepped up pretty quickly. He didn't deliver all the state-of-the-art weapons to Ukraine on day one. He actually did dribble in, and people wondered about that strategy, but he's also sending a message to Putin, with all due respect, we hate Putin and he should do that, but Putin is the president, the autocratic dictator president of a country with more nuclear weapons than any other country in the world. So how you respond to Putin's aggression is not just give him a punch in the nose and show him who's boss. So there's nuance, and I think that had a role to play in how the United States and the West reacted at the very beginning. And Ukraine is historically an incredibly corrupt country, and you want to make sure that the dollars delivered are going to the right place. Ukraine foreign policy, entanglements in other people's war, immigration is going to be one of the biggest topics on the table, and Trump knows that, which is why he pulled the plug under the bipartisan effort to get a deal passed, because he knows that he can win on immigration, because it's a disaster. By the way, the amount of people flowing in, or certainly the amount of people being captured by ICE, the immigration sort of enforcement authority, is the same. It was the same under Obama, the same under Trump, the same under Biden. A lot more people now are trying to come to the United States for fear of a Trump presidency. You know, go now. If I'm in Guatemala or El Salvador, I say, this is pretty terrible, but I can hang out for another year. No, you can't. Get there now, because next year there'll be a new sheriff in town. But so the domestic issues, the big domestic issues, are going to be immigration, abortion. I think that the Dobbs decision is going to be used a lot by Democrats. I think that the country as a whole felt that was overreach, and people liked Roe v. Wade. I think Roe v. Wade was a popular compromise among a pretty broad cross-section of the population. And foreign entanglements. You know, should we be sending the military to patrol the border and capture immigrants that came in illegally and send them back to Mexico or other countries in Central America? And there are very different opinions on that. I mean, it's a violation of international law unless the Mexicans say, yeah, come on in and blow up our cartels. I think that it's going to be a very animated campaign process, and that's going to be another challenge for President Biden, because I think that in an animated cacophony of just sensationalist campaigning, he's not as vigorous, and I think people are going to see that as being old, frail, and tired, and you know, he'll try to get as many surrogates out there as possible who will be, you know, from Gavin Newsom to Taylor Swift, right? I mean, who doesn't like Taylor Swift? But I don't know that Taylor Swift, with all of her charm and followers, will be able to overcome that perception that the president isn't able to deliver the message that he wants. But it's too early to tell. The only thing that I can predict with certainty is that this is going to be an incredibly ugly year in the United States of America, with repercussions for the entire world. Shabbat Shalom.